The following audio recording has been designed for learning purposes only. Do not share, distribute, or provide any type of copies, or this audio lesson will not be made available to you. Good luck with today's lesson.
Veterans and their families from World War I who were due to be paid a bonus in 1945, but of course they needed the money at the time of the Great Depression, and they didn't get it right away. They eventually will get their money in a few years after Roosevelt comes to office, and Congress will take up the matter again. But actually it's still several years, something like 1930, maybe 19. I'll look it up. 37, I believe. So it was a few years. So Roosevelt, of course, does get elected in November of 1932, and then will become president of the United States in 1933, March of 33. But before we get to that, since I'm kind of on a roll with bringing out these little documentaries on all the presidents this last week, I thought I'd show you Herbert Hoover next. You know, Herbert Hoover gets a bad rap because he had the unfortunate luck of serving as President of the United States at the time of the Great Depression.
Vision of Thomas Jefferson. The same could not be said about his successor, one of the most energetic and competent men ever to reach the high office, with his own profound ideas about America. He was Herbert Hoover.
I am an American individualist. My whole life has taught me what America means. I was an engineer, and my profession took me into many foreign lands. And outstanding everywhere to these great masses of people, there is one hallowed word. That word is America.
Herbert Hoover was called the Great Engineer. He really was a great engineer. He believed problems existed to be solved. He had himself done some remarkable things. Hoover was, in his way, a visionary, perhaps more visionary than Thomas Jefferson.
Herbert Clark Hoover was the son of a small-town Iowa blacksmith and a kindly Quaker mother, whose simple, humane faith would become an important influence in his life. At age 9, he was orphaned and shipped off to Oregon to be the ward of an uncle who taught him never to allow himself to be pushed around.
One of his expressions was, turn your other cheek once, but if he smites it, then punch him.
A member of Stanford's first graduating class, he received a degree in geology. The shy, tactless young man then headed for Nevada City, where he worked 70 hours a week pushing ore carts in a gold mine. Eventually, he was hired by a British mining firm and sent to Australia. By his expert ability to recognize promising mines, Hoover rose rapidly in its ranks. Over the next decade and a half, he circled the globe 5 times and became a multimillionaire.
If a man has not made $1 million by the time he is 40, he is not worth much.
In 1914, Hoover turned his enormous energy and talents to public service. World War I had just begun, and millions of Belgian citizens, caught by the German invasion, were on the verge of starvation. Taking charge of a relief effort spearheaded by the United States, Hoover set out to feed and clothe the Belgians and to prevent their slaughter. Never before had a humanitarian project this large and bold been attempted.
We are turning barren neutrality into something positive.
Hoover's American Commission for Relief in Belgium made its own rules, crossed borders at will, and gathered food in any way it could. His 1914 German passport stated, "This man is not to be stopped anywhere under any circumstances." After the war, Hoover became known around the world as the Food Czar, saving millions of men, women, and children from starvation.
Our free feeding of millions of undernourished children, that was American. European governments had nothing to do with it.
He became a philosopher of the American way, offering his own vision of American volunteerism and generosity.
In all my years of professional traveling, every homecoming was an inspiration, a proof of the glory of America. I was each time refreshed by its greater kindliness and its greater spread of opportunity to the common man. It was more than that. It was a land of self-respect that comes alone from freedom of the spirit.
By 1921, Hoover was named President Harding's Secretary of Commerce, a post to which he was reappointed by Calvin Coolidge. He was soon being described as Undersecretary of Everything Else, working on problems of aviation and farming and child hygiene and the regulation of the airwaves. He seemed to be almost everywhere at once. When massive flooding occurred along the Mississippi River, it was Hoover who personally oversaw the relief effort. Letters addressed simply to the Miracle Man, Washington, D.C., invariably got delivered. And when Coolidge chose not to run again in 1928, it was almost inevitable who would be the next president.
I am convinced this country needs a few officials who will not be seeking public honors for having done their simple duty.
As president, Hoover called for volunteerism backed up by government programs and support. He worked on behalf of child welfare, conservation, civil liberties, and public education, and he was a strong advocate of the rights of Native Americans.
I have no dread of the ordinary work of the presidency. What I do fear is the exaggerated idea that people have conceived of me. They have a conviction that I am a sort of Superman, that no problem is beyond my capacity. If some unprecedented calamity should come upon the nation, I would be sacrificed to the unreasoning disappointment of a people who expected too much.
Just 7 months into his presidency, that national calamity occurred with the crash of the stock market. And for the first time in his life, Hoover was faced with a force over which he had no control.
When one watches the response in Hoover's time to the Great Depression as it actually developed, one realizes that people were at sea, intellectually at sea. Something was happening that had not happened before. He was totally unprepared for what happened.
Hoover's concept of a public-private partnership was inadequate to the emergency. Local governments could not cope with the immensity of the crisis, and private volunteerism, contrary to his expectations, failed to materialize. On top of this, the president himself was changing. Unaccustomed to failure or to negative publicity, Hoover became strangely passive and distant during the Great Depression. And when the millionaire president made the public statement that nobody in the country is actually starving, the American people turned against him. In time, his very name began to spell hate and hunger to millions. Poverty-stricken shanty towns became known as Hoovervilles. Newspapers that homeless men slept under were called Hoover blankets. And broken-down vehicles pulled by mules, an increasingly common sight, were dubbed Hoover wagons. Seeing the president as uncaring and out of touch with reality, the country began to look for a more compassionate political leader.
As the Depression deepened, more and more members of the American public changed their notion of what they wanted in the presidency. This happens all the time in America. The great engineer looked very authoritative in 1929. By 1931, he looked like the quintessential stuffed shirt. By 1932, he looked positively unfriendly, uncaring. High starched collars, a jowly face above the collar. Compare that with Franklin Roosevelt's public presentation in the 1932 election. He projected warmth, enthusiasm, concern, and caring. And the contrast was extraordinary.
In the final year of his presidency, Hoover initiated a series of important federal measures to provide food for hungry Americans and to shore up the banking system. But to his critics, it all seemed too little, too late. Just 14 weeks before the national election, thousands of unemployed veterans descended upon Washington with their wives and children, seeking an early payment of a war bonus. When the Senate failed to pass such a bill, the group calling itself the Bonus Army staged what it called a death march around the Capitol building. Congressmen trapped inside and fearing for their lives had to escape through subterranean tunnels. When a riot erupted and the protesters turned toward the White House, President Hoover authorized the U.S. Army to intervene. With their temporary huts set on fire, the protesters were run out of the city. Refugees, they complained, from a heartless government. When Franklin Roosevelt heard of the rout, he said, "This will elect me."
Many Democratic speakers implied that I had murdered veterans on the streets of Washington. Democracy is not a polite employer. The only way out of elective office is to get sick or die or get kicked out.
A bitter Herbert Hoover never got over his crushing defeat that year. After leaving office, he did what he had done at regular intervals all his life. He went fishing. In different times, he might have been one of our most successful presidents. But even 3 decades later, in the 1960s, the old man still could not escape from the indictment of a failed presidency. Even so, as he showed in his last televised interview, Hoover's faith in America, like fishing, never dimmed.
There have been presidents like Grover Cleveland and myself who have been fishermen from boyhood. We got the habit. Perhaps without immodesty, I can say to have had some experience in what the word America means. Within the soul of America is freedom of mind and spirit. Perhaps it's not perfect, but it is more full of its realization here than in any other place in the world.
Following Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt redefined the American way to include big government working on behalf.
All right. So, we'll end there. Now. Before we move on to Roosevelt, I just want to go back over a couple slides that I showed you the other day, just because it's a very important thing to remember about Hoover is that in January of 32, he supported the creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided $1.5 billion to shore up essentially the banking system, which in the end, of course, was too little amount of money, too late, and they had all kinds of stipulations. And then the Emergency Relief Act later that year in 32 that loaned money to the states so that the states could create jobs programs and help people go back to work. All too little, too late. But leading the way, of course, for the Roosevelt New Deal programs that would come shortly after this. So something that's often, I think, not stressed enough about Hoover, that he really was changing his ideas and his ways to deal with the severity of this economic crisis. All right. So Roosevelt almost didn't make it to the White House. Had an assassin been a better aim. And in February of 1932, just a few weeks before the inauguration, the president-elect was in Florida, and there's an attempt on his life.
5 p.m. At 9:35 p.m. on the evening of February the 15th, Franklin Roosevelt had just completed offering a few remarks. Then a young Italian immigrant, 5'1", stood up on a bench, and he reached in his pocket, got out a cheap $8 pistol, and pointed it at the President-elect of the United States. A woman standing next to him saw what was happening, and in her mind she said, "My God, he's going to kill Franklin Roosevelt."
When the first shot was fired, I realized he was shooting at someone, and I taken my right arm and pushed the pistol out just as hard as I could.
Instead of the bullet hitting Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the bullet hit a man by the name of Anton Cermak, who was the mayor of Chicago, Illinois. Cermak was driven in Roosevelt's car, cradled in Roosevelt's arms, all the way to a Miami hospital.
Cermak, mortally wounded with a bullet in his lungs, told FDR, "I'm glad it was me instead of you." The gun-waving man was Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian-born unemployed bricklayer.
Giuseppe Zangara, better known as Joe, was not an anarchist. That was proved later on. He was a person who did not like leaders of any country.
You don't like it for president. That's all. As a man, he's all right.
Joe Zangara was sentenced by the judge 80 years in prison for the attempted assassination on Anton Cermak. But on March 6th, 1933, Cermak died, and immediately then the judge decreed that Cermak's assassin should be executed, and he was on March 20th, 1933.
Zangara Hoover's last words before his electrocution were, "Goodbye, adieu to the world. Go ahead, push the button."
They didn't mess around in those days when they sentenced you to death. That was fast. Crazy. So, when Franklin Roosevelt had this assassination attempt on his life, which of course did kill the mayor of Chicago, the nation's banks were in free fall. This is a crisis that had been occurring over the winter of 1933, and pretty much most of the nation's banks were closed by the time Roosevelt took the oath of office in March. And so it was a really desperate time in our nation's history. As the banks closed, those that closed for good and never reopened meant that you did not ever see your money again. So it's estimated that about 9 million people lost their life savings. Some banks, like in Michigan, what had happened was when this crisis started here in Michigan, the largest bank, the most important bank in the state, the Guardian Union Group Bank, couldn't meet its obligations in January. It was $44 million short in cash. Didn't mean that it didn't have investments, but the problem was they couldn't come up with the cash to meet their customers' needs. And the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, only established the year before to provide loans to such institutions, they would not come up with the $44 million. They would come up with about $22 million, but they insisted that some of their main depositors in this bank, which of course being Detroit was the auto industry, that they put up the rest of the money. And so that would have meant obviously General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. The problem was General Motors and Ford, General Motors said fine, Chrysler said fine, but Ford said no way. Mr. Ford, Henry Ford, is still alive, running things, one of the richest men in the world, but he refused to guarantee what really would have only been just over $7 million. So in the end, the deal fell through. It led to a crisis because the governor had to issue an order that all the banks needed to be closed, and they could then reopen. After a few weeks, they were allowed to reopen, but only for a few hours a day, and they could only give out, or could only take out small amounts from your accounts. So this is the situation we found ourselves in here in Michigan, but this is a similar situation to what was going on around the country. And nobody was trusting the banks anymore. People stopped. Of course, remember I said the other day, 25% of the working population is out of work, which means another 75%, of course, still working, still getting their paychecks, but people were afraid to use the banks anymore. So people are just, keeping the money. If, of course, they can cash their checks and take it out. So it's a great time of uncertainty. And so what Roosevelt does when he comes into office is he will close the banks and in what's called the bank holiday, which I'll show you a short clip of the talk he gives on the radio about it. But this is actually a photograph of the president taking the oath of office on March the 4th, 1933, of course, and when he tries to ensure the nation that things will be okay. So the whole nation is looking to him now to do something about the Great Depression, something that Hoover was unable to handle. And of course, it has to be said that the Depression will never end. Unemployment will always be high, but it will be certainly very helpful, the programs that Roosevelt puts into place.
Consecration. And I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. We face our common difficulties. They concern, thank God, only material things. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no market for their produce, and the savings of many years and thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number sparkle with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And yet we are sickened by no plague of locusts. Compared with the perils which our forefathers conquered, we have still much to be thankful for. Nature still offers her bounty, and human efforts have multiplied it. Plenty is at our doorstep.
So,
this is a day of national confidence.
So Roosevelt is there in his inauguration trying to assure the public that things will be okay. The first thing he needs to do is take on this banking crisis. So so what he does is he issues what's known as a bank holiday, and then he'll go on the radio and talk to the public about what measures the government is taking to fix the banking situation. And this is known as a fireside chat. It's radio broadcasts that the president did from time to time. The public really appreciated that. He's not the first president to use the radio, but he's the first president to really use it quite effectively in times of crisis like this. During the Great Depression, he would use the radio. Of course, he would serve as president during World War II, and he would go on from time to time at certain times. He didn't do it very often. He only did it a few times a year. He felt that he should only do it when he felt it was absolutely necessary, and because it's more effective that way. You all know, like, if people talk too much, you just stop listening. And so he only did it when he felt it was really absolutely necessary. But the public really felt like he was talking to them. And that definitely certainly helped him politically. And when he would give these talks, the people, felt that they could really trust him because they felt like he was talking directly to them. So this is his first fireside chat, trying to reassure the public that the banking crisis is going to be fixed. And in fact, they did fix it. Congress will pass measures to ensure that people's deposits are insured. Then FDIC is created, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is created out of this crisis. And when the banks do reopen, the public starts to put their money back in the banks, because the government could do whatever they wanted, and then if the public didn't believe them and didn't put any money in the banks, the crisis would still continue. But the public did start to use the banks again, and that was really important. The problem with getting your money back, though, was that even though it was insured, it took years to sort this financial mess out. And in some cases, it's not till after World War II that people got their money back. Some banks, of course, are closed during this crisis. Some banks had to be reorganized and taken over by other more solvent banks, and that's what happens as well. But it was a financial mess that took well over a decade to sort out. My great-grandparents actually, unfortunately, had their money in one of the Detroit banks that closed permanently. And even though they were guaranteed then under the new laws that they would get their money back, they didn't get their money back until 1949. And this is March 1933. So it was a long wait for some people.
I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks. I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days and why it was done and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations and so forth, couched for the most part in banking and legal terms, ought to be explained for the benefit of the average citizen. I owe this in particular because of the fortitude and the good temper with which everybody has accepted the inconvenience and the hardships of the banking holiday. And I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about, I shall continue to have your cooperation as fully as I have had your sympathy and your help during the past week. First of all, let me state the simple fact that when you deposit money in a bank, the bank does not put the money into a safe deposit vault. It invests your money in many different forms of credit, in bonds, in commercial paper, in mortgages, and in many other kinds of loans. In other words, the bank puts your money to work to keep the wheels of industry and of agriculture turning round. A comparatively small part of the money that you put into the bank is kept in currency, an amount which in normal times is fully sufficient to cover the cash needs of the average citizen. In other words, the total amount of all the currency in the country is only a comparatively small proportion of the total deposits in all the banks of the country. What then happened during the last few days of February and the first few days of March? Because of undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks couldn't get enough currency to meet the demand. The reason for this was that on the spur of the moment, it was of course impossible to sell perfectly sound assets to the bank and convert them into cash, except at panic prices far below their real value. By the afternoon of March 3rd, a week ago last Friday, scarcely a bank in the country was open to do business. Proclamations closing them in whole or in part had been issued by the governors in almost all of the states. It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric. The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation of our banking facilities. And I want to tell our citizens in every part of the nation that the National Congress, Republicans and Democrats alike, showed by this action a devotion to public welfare and a realization of the emergency and the necessity for speed that it is difficult to match in all our history. The third stage has been the series of regulations permitting the banks to continue their functions to take care of the distribution of food household necessities and the payment of payroll. This bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. Remember that no sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors last week. Neither is any bank which may turn out not to be in a position for immediate opening. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. The new currency is being sent out by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing in large volume to every part of the country. It is sound currency because it is backed by actual good assets.
So, with that, the banking crisis will end. And the president mentioned how quickly Congress dealt with the situation. The Emergency Banking Act passes in one day, March the 9th, 1933. Remarkable. It can take months, if not years sometimes, for a piece of legislation to work its way through Congress. And but of course, this depression was quite extraordinary. The country had never seen a financial crisis this terrible before. And so they passed the Emergency Relief Act. For the first time in American history, the government will actually start giving people some money. It's really the first welfare program, other than, of course, the Freedmen's Bureau, which existed for a short time to help the freedmen after the Civil War. And if you got money, if you were in such desperate state that you needed to get money through the Relief Act, they would call it being on the dole. I don't know where that term came from, but that's what they used to say. The Securities Act, the first major law to regulate the stock market. Of course, the stock market is over-investing in the stock market, really manipulation of the stock market, an economy that was propped up on paper profits in the 1920s and with too few corporations controlling the major corporate wealth, led to a stock market that was overinflated and people manipulating it to their own benefit, but of course eventually led to the major crash. So now the stock market is being regulated. And who's put in charge of the Securities and Exchange Commission? Joseph P. Kennedy, actually a man who made a great deal of money because he knew the ins and outs of the flaws of the stock market. And Joseph Kennedy, have you heard of Joseph Kennedy? Some of you know. He was the father of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who would later be President of the United States. So the federal government will start going into the jobs business. So unlike under Hoover, where Hoover was willing to loan money to states, and then states were supposed to somehow employ people within their own individual state, the federal government took control of creating jobs for the entire nation. And so there were a lot of major earth-moving projects. Billions of dollars are put up through various public works programs that are created. The Public Works Administration, which was created in 1933, continues until 1941. Spent over $6 billion on 34,000 projects. Majority of the nation's schools that are built in the 1930s are paid for with federal dollars. A third of the hospitals in this country that were built at the time were paid for with federal dollars. And so it's jobs programs like this that puts large numbers of people physically back to work, both doing the manual labor, actually working for the government, or putting, of course, the companies that were creating the supplies that were needed for these projects. So, for instance, U.S. Steel, major United States corporation in Pittsburgh, putting thousands of people back to work in the steel industry. U.S. Steel, at the worst point during the Great Depression, actually had laid off all their full-time workers. Probably my favorite of the programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps that's created. And it was created to put young people back to work. Young people's unemployment rates were very high, much higher than the average 25%. And so it employed 3 million men, actually only 8,500 women, because women were only hired for a short time in early on, and then for whatever reason it was decided that women were not going to be allowed anymore. So it's primarily young men, 17 to 25 years old, who of course in general were living at home with their parents, couldn't find work, and therefore felt that they were a burden to their families. And now this program gives them something to do. It provides them with a wage, although a small wage, much lower than the average wage of the day. They're only making $1 a day. And so that's really, going back to the 19th century labor wages, more the mid-19th century wages. Actually, there was a lot of pushback by the unions saying this isn't fair, they need to be making more money. But in the end, it was a program that was really appreciated by young people as well as their families, because the way that it was structured was that the men would go out working on federal lands as well as state lands, doing a lot of physical labor. It might be installing power lines, it might be digging ditches, it might be building roads, planting trees. A lot of the trees in Michigan state forests, which had been cut down during the logging days of the 19th century, are replanted by CCC workers in the 1930s. So when you go up north, and a lot of times if you notice, even driving along I-75, if you notice there's a lot of forest land that the trees are all planted in straight rows, and that's because that's the way they did it during the Depression. And you'll see it both in the Lower Peninsula and the UP as well.
If you're in a national forest.
That's pretty close.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I don't think I've been there. At least I haven't done
You
it
go
in a
down,
long
go
time.
up 65, you'll go right through it.
Okay. And the way the pay was structured was that you would, the $30 was what you got paid, but actually you only saw $5 of that because all of your expenses were being paid, your housing, your food, and so the $5 a month was supposed to be for whatever kind of incidental things that you might want to buy at the little general stores in these rural areas where you're, gum or cigarettes, things like that. They didn't know that cigarettes were going to kill you in those days. They just thought it would stunt your growth. So they did. They literally would tell kids, well, you probably shouldn't smoke because it's going to stunt your growth and you won't grow as tall. So, and the rest of the money goes home to your family, so to your parents and your brothers and sisters who were not old enough to work in this program. And so that really was a big boost to help really feed your family. And in the days when a loaf of bread might cost 5 cents, $25 can go a long way. This is a news report that was done just 2-3 years ago relating to the CCS, and a guy who wrote a book on it, the CCC, sorry.
Many of the lodges, picnic shelters, dams, and trails found in state and federal parks across the U.S. were built 8 decades ago by young men who were in many cases not even old enough to vote. They were members of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and often referred to as the boys of the CCC.
They were paid $1 a day, $30 a month. $1 back then was worth $20 a day. You could buy a dozen eggs for 7 cents. A new pair of shoes for $1.50, 5 gallons of gas for $1. So it was actually a pretty fair deal. 3 square meals a day, a lot of food. It was a big step up for a lot of guys.
Bill Jamerson has spent a lot of time researching and interviewing the young men who were part of the federal conservation effort that stretched across the United States. He has written a book called Big Shoulders, produced the documentary Camp Forgotten, and performs on the CD Crazy Khaki Kids, which is a collection of songs he wrote about life in the Civilian Conservation Corps.
I planted about 10,000.
Okay,
Stories
can't listen to that.
bring back memories. They bring back memories.
In 1933, the United States was suffering through the Great Depression, a time when stocks lost 89% of their value and nearly 1 in 4 Americans were out of work. Many voters felt it was time for a new deal from a new president. Franklin Delano Roosevelt became that new president, and in his first month in office, he created a number of back-to-work programs known as the New Deal. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, was one of the first New Deal programs that made the federal government the employer of last resort.
Times were rough. My dad had died, and my brother was still at home, and you couldn't find a job or anything, and we had lost the farm where my dad had spent his lifetime saving up a little to buy a farm. You need to eat money. My mother needed eating money.
I'm going down to DCCC.
Only single men between the ages of 18 and 25, whose families were on relief, were eligible to join the Civilian Conservation Corps. A CCC boy received room and board, clothing, training, and a monthly paycheck of $30, 25 of which was sent home to his family.
After inspecting Skyland, the Commander-in-Chief takes a seat at the head of the table to eat with the boys, and he enjoys every bite of the plain, wholesome food furnished at the camp.
It's very good to be here at these Virginia CCC camps. I wish I could see them all over the country. I wish that I could take a couple of months off from the White House and come down here and live with them, because I know I'd get full of health the way they have. The only difference is that they've put on an average of about 12 pounds apiece since they got here, and I'm trying to take off 12 pounds.
Despite its name, the Civilian Conservation Corps was in many ways a military organization. U.S. Army officers commanded the camps. Even the equipment was military, with much of it, including the uniforms, being World War I surplus. A typical day in a CCC camp started with reveille at 6 a.m., followed by roll call, calisthenics, breakfast, and then cleanup. And at 8 a.m. sharp, the work began.
They would take us down to a big area there where we all lined up, and the government would turn us over to the state to go to work for the state. And it was all state work from then on till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they turned you back over to the government again.
The purpose of the CCC was to help the nation's human resources while simultaneously improving America's natural resources. The work of the Civilian Conservation Corps extended well beyond the many stone structures found in state parks today across the United States. Often referred to as Roosevelt's Tree Army, the work of CCC boys extended to projects including reforestation, revitalization of overworked agricultural land, and preventing soil erosion. In fact, 75% of CCC work projects were administered by the Department of Agriculture. Besides fighting fires, erecting more than 3,000 fire towers, and planting 3 billion trees, CCC boys constructed dams, built irrigation canals that provided essential water to western farms, and dug ditches that drained more than 84 million acres of agricultural land.
we were in a soil conservation group, and there was lots of shovel work involved. I think we had one little cap that they could use for moving larger quantities or heavy rocks and stuff like that. But most of it was done by hand with picks and shovels. I grew up in a hurry, I can tell you that.
During the Great Depression, the CCC provided economic relief to families by putting approximately 3 million young men to work. It gave the CCC boys the tools they would need to become successes later in life. And the CCC gave the nation improvements to natural and agricultural resources that are still visible across America's landscape 80 years later.
I look at it now as probably the best thing that ever happened to us. Us young people then that didn't have a job, and I think it was a good deal. I think Franklin Roosevelt knew what he was doing.
For Market to Market, I'm Paul Yeager.
So that's one of the certainly an important part of helping to put the nation back to work. And of course, these jobs programs, it's really quite remarkable when you think about it. When you go from just shortly before this period, where government officials, thought that it was absolutely ridiculous for the government to be involved in people's daily lives, and to now that the government is a very active part of people's everyday life. And another one of the works projects, the Works Progress Administration, was building lots of roads, 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings in the 1930s and early 40s. It actually exists into the years of World War II even. Of course, it became unnecessary to have a jobs program by 1943 when it's abolished, because there was so much work. There were more jobs available than there were actually people during the Second World War. You go from having not enough jobs to having so many jobs that there's not enough people to fill them by the early 1940s. Airports, bridges, parks are being built. If you've ever gone down to Toledo, to the Toledo Zoo, it's actually built by one of these jobs programs. And a lot of the original buildings from the 30s will have plaques on them stating that. So, if you've never been to Toledo Zoo, you should really go down there and take a look at it. It's really nice. It's not that far either. So they spent $11 billion and employed 8.5 million people. Here's this photograph. Actually, I use it because this is actually the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. And because the president had contracted polio in the 1920s, what the public didn't know was that he really didn't have the use of his legs. Although when they would see him in newsreel photos, newsreels were the visual news of the day that you would have to go to theaters to actually see. But it always looked like he was walking. But they knew that he wore leg braces, but they didn't realize that he was really very much handicapped, that he got around on a daily basis in a wheelchair, because there was so much prejudice towards handicapped people in those days that literally, like, families were embarrassed by their relatives who were handicapped, and like people would basically lock their handicapped relatives away, and they often didn't leave their houses. So it was a terrible situation that you found yourself in if you had a disability in those days. And there were buildings were very much inaccessible in those days as well. It's not till something like 25 years ago that the law was passed to make buildings and sidewalks and accessible for people with disabilities. So for really most of the 20th century, if you were handicapped, it was very difficult to get anywhere out in public. But because of the president's handicap, of course, because he was president, there were all special things that were done whenever he was going to go anywhere. Big ramps would be built to the top steps of public buildings and churches if he had to be somewhere, so the president could just get out right at the top step with his leg braces and with the help of an aide, usually one of his sons. It looked like he was walking. He just had a great deal of upper body strength. He swam all the time, and it looked like he was walking, but he was basically being dragged along whenever he had to appear to walk. He would just kind of shift along with this upper body strength of his son. And so Mrs. Roosevelt, because of that, is often sent out to be the eyes and the ears of the president. And whether it be in this country or abroad, she was often traveled to other countries on behalf of the president as well. And she would come back and report to him. Mrs. Roosevelt was really one of his most trusted advisors, although their marriage was not really much of a marriage after she had found out many years earlier that he had been having an affair with her secretary. And so she was going to divorce him, but she agreed to remain because he and his mother convinced her that there's no way he would ever be able to gain the presidency if he were to be divorced, because in those days it was still a really bad idea if you were a politician to be divorced, because people would hold it against you and not vote for you. So she stuck with him, but anyway, we actually do know that, and she had made him promise that he would never see that woman again, but he actually did. I'll talk more about that later on. So, one last works program that I find fascinating is that, of course, during economic times, whether it was 80 years ago or today, is that generally the arts get cut first. And so lots of talented, creative people found themselves out of work during the Great Depression. And so part of the federal works programs were that they had the Federal Arts Project, the Federal Writers Project, and the Federal Theater Project that put lots of talented people back to work, whether it be acting or singing or writing or creating works of art in all different mediums. And so public buildings, government buildings were decorated with artists that were hired in these programs. So lots of, if you've ever been to an old post office built in the 1930s, they often have big murals on their walls that were created from this program. Or if you've ever been to a national park, and in a lot of the old hotels that were built during the Great Depression as part of these programs, and then they had these artistic people come in and create works of art for them. I used this image actually because it's a federal theater program. If you notice, because they call African American people, they call Negro unit there as a term used at the time. But it was a troupe of African American actors who were hired as part of the federal theater program. Actually, Orson Welles, who was a famous actor, worked for this program in the 1930s, early in his career, and worked with African American actors and actresses. All right, so moving on, the Social Security is created during the Great Depression. It was created to aid senior citizens who found themselves with, I'm sure with many of them with their savings wiped out due to the closure of the banks. And so, but it was also created to help those who were blind as well as dependent mothers with children. And I think it's interesting. I don't exactly know how the part worked with the blind, but it, anyway, of course, in those days they thought no matter what your handicap was that you couldn't work or you couldn't perform, you know, any type of job. Like I said, Roosevelt would never have become president of the United States because they thought he wouldn't have been fit for office. Of course, there was obviously nothing wrong with his mind. But anyway, so Social Security is created. It wasn't meant to be a retirement plan that you could live on. It was meant, just as it is today, to help subsidize your income in your retirement. So, you only could start collecting it at 65 years old, because in those days the average life expectancy was 65. So they figured you would probably only collect it for a year or two once you retired. But what nobody expected was that medical science would change so rapidly, and people would start living to be much, much older than 65 years old. And so
that's why you
that
keep
actually
changing it.
That's actually part of the issue. But also, you know, you have to realize that when, you know, if you listen to cable news or whatever, which I try not to listen to because there's a lot of insane people on there, but is, you know, when they always complain about government programs or whatever and say, oh, you know, the government's giving this money, we have to get rid of things. Well, you know, you all probably have a job or had a job at some point, right? You have to pay Social Security tax. That's not just money that's being taken away as a tax and you're never going to see it again. It's money that's the idea of this is that it's going to be there for you in the future. Well, I don't know. I mean, it's something we all have to worry about. So.
You gotta worry about it. What do you think we gotta
Yeah, I
worry
know.
about?
So, you know, something to think about when people say, oh, it's a government giveaway. It's not. It's something that you're paying out with the idea that you're going to get it back. They need to be responsible with the money. That's what they need to do. So for all these weeks, you know, I've been telling you bad stories about what happened to the average worker in this country. You know, it seems to be a reoccurring theme every chapter, right? Finally, after decades and decades of workers not being treated right, you know, being fired for joining unions, being forced to sign yellow dog contracts that said that they could be fired if they joined the union. Finally, there's a federal law that protects people from the abuses of their bosses. So the Wagner Act, or what formerly called the Wagner National Labor Relations Act, guarantees workers' rights to organize unions. No longer can you be fired for being a union member or for working on behalf of the union. So, and that's is really significant. So any type of unfair labor practice is banned under this law. In order to, one of the first major strikes that occurs after the passage of the Wagner Act is actually to do with the auto industry. It actually starts, basically, they do the first auto sit-down strike. It wasn't in Flint, it's actually at Kelsey Hayes, and we'll see a little video of that in a moment. And then they move on to the Flint sit-down strike. The Flint sit-down strike is a major move forward in the recognition of one of the large unions and getting major corporations to recognize one union as a union for all their workers, no matter what area they work in. See, the problem was at that time was big corporations didn't want to have one big union. What they wanted to have was lots of small unions that could negotiate separately, of course, because that the unions would not be as strong. And the United Auto Workers said, no, we want to represent, and we are going to represent all the workers working to build a car. And that's something that General Motors was adamant that they wouldn't do, and so the UAW then goes on strike. And they use the tactic of a sit-down strike. Actually, something that had been developed earlier in the century by the international workers of the world, and then is appropriated now with union workers in the 1930s, and then later during the civil rights movement, and then even later on with the student rights movement, so the 1950s and 60s, they'll adopt these tactics as well, because they're a very effective form of nonviolent protesting. So the Flint sit-down strike lasts for about 6 weeks. So it was quite a long time, especially if you consider it's the middle of winter. And eventually what happens is all the power and the heat gets turned off. And so these guys are living in there for over a month in really pretty harsh conditions. So by shutting down the Flint plant, and then actually the strike would kind of progress. What happened is the UAW started shutting down other plants around the country. They're able to shut down production at General Motors. But the Fisher Body plant up in Flint was really, really important, a major portion of General Motors operations. And without production there, it became very difficult to build cars for GM. And it would lead, of course, to the UAW being recognized by General Motors, and then by Chrysler, and then finally, but not till 1941, by Ford. So they finally came to an agreement in March. The strike ended in February, but then they reach a final agreement in March, and that was really major. Chrysler came to the bargaining table within a few months, but like I said, Ford Motor Company, Henry Ford still owned the company, did not like unions, refused to negotiate, was really had brutal tactics, had a really nasty security, just nasty security for his plants. And here's a photograph taken in 1937, just as they're about to throw this union organizers down the stairs here. He would later die from his injuries. Ford Security was run by a guy named Harry Bennett, who was basically no better than like a mobster. Yeah, right. And my grandpa actually worked for the Ford Motor Company around this time, and I asked him one time, did you ever see Harry Bennett? And my grandpa said, only once, on the top floor of the Highland Park plant down in Highland Park, Michigan. And he said he was shooting light bulbs out of all the light bulbs on the floor with his revolver. But even the Ford Motor Company would be forced to the bargaining table due to government pressure in 1941. As the war in Europe got worse, and as it increasingly became evident that we were probably going to join the war at any time, Ford was forced to recognize the United Auto Workers. The federal government was already, making plans for if we did enter the war. They didn't want to have a lot of union problems, shutdowns on the floors of the factories, and so they wanted to ensure that Ford was unionized. All right. So I'll go back. So this is from a documentary done many years ago, actually, because of course people who participated in the sit-down strikes of the 1930s are, I'm not going to say they're all gone, but unfortunately mostly gone. So it was made, luckily at a time when most of the people were still around.
The fledgling auto union gathered in South Bend, Indiana, and began to plan their strategy for organizing the auto industry. The United Automobile Workers, the UAW, was formed.
Homer Mark was elected president. He was a very glamorous person. He was an ex-preacher, wonderful platform man. He had made a speech or two, and the workers said, "Oh boy, that's our man. He'll be our president." There were all kinds of people for the first time. Walter Reuther, for instance, appears for the first time as a leading person. He was elected as one of the members of the executive board at South Bend.
Walter Reuther began organizing in Detroit. He demonstrated his shrewdness in the selection of his first target. Instead of confronting the giant Ford Motor Company directly, he would get at Ford through a vital supplier, the Kelsey Hayes Wheel Company. They manufactured Ford's brake shoes. Without brake shoes, Ford couldn't make cars. One of the organizers inside Kelsey Hayes was Reuther's brother.
There was a woman working next to me, a young mother, who I think had real worries at home about whether her children were being cared for because, no daycare centers, and maybe she didn't have a mother around to care for them, but every time I conversed with her, her concern was about her children. She needed the job. She was under incredible pressure, and she produced more pieces per hour than I did. Her fingers were more nimble, but she only got 21.5 cents an hour, and I got 32.5 cents an hour. I don't know what these half cents were for, but women automatically, even when they did more work than men at a job, were automatically paid less. One day she was under such terrible pressure she fainted. Walter said, "We've got to do something dramatic."
Instead of sending pickets to march outside the plant, he would use a revolutionary new tactic, the sit-down strike. A small group of people could bring production to a halt by sitting down inside the plant. The woman who had fainted was the perfect person to spark the strike.
And he turned to this young mother and he said, "Do you think you could faint again, but on schedule?" And the change of shift came on Tuesday, and she fainted, and I walked over and pulled the main switch. And the superintendent of the whole department came pounding down, threatening people they're going to be fired if they didn't go back to work. He came over and raised hell with me, said they're going to be fired, get back to work. And I said, "No, there's only one person who can get him back to work." "Who in the hell's that?" I said, "His name's Walter Reuther, and here's his telephone number." And Walter was sitting, waiting for the call.
The workers were startled to discover that they had actually stopped production. They held the plant for 9 days. Ford threatened to take its business elsewhere, and Kelsey Hayes was forced to settle with the union. The UAW won the right to organize and an increase in pay for all workers. And Walter Reuther won his first victory. The UAW was on its way. Its next objective, to organize the mammoth General Motors complex in Flint, Michigan. GM was now the largest auto manufacturer in the world.
We were worried, how are we going to tackle Flint with 42,000 workers, a city that was really like almost a feudal domain of General Motors. They controlled everything there.
The city of Flint passed an ordinance that only two can meet. The ordinance stop and talk on the streets, and they break it up. They break it up if three of you stop, they'd be mad, they'd break it up.
Threatened by a hostile police force and constantly watched by company spies, the union organizers were forced to hold secret meetings. Slowly, they built a corps of men they could trust.
The break came one day in December. Workers at the Fisher body plant punched in as usual. An ordinary day. Then something happened. Or rather, nothing happened. Nothing moved. The workers had sat down. They would not work, and they would stay in the factory until General Motors signed a contract with their union.
When they tie hands to a union man,
Sit down, sit down.
when they give him the sack, they'll take him back.
Sit down, sit down. Sit down and take a seat. Sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you've got a seat. Sit down, sit down.
When they smile and say, no raise and pay.
Sit down.
When you want to cross, they come across.
Sit down, sit down. Sit down and take a seat. Sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you've got a seat. Sit down, sit down.
On January 4th, 1937, GM went to court and obtained an injunction ordering the strikers to leave the plant. It was issued by a local judge.
The union attorneys discovered that he was had a massive holding of GM stock, which he had not bothered to disclose, although he was sitting in judgment on a GM matter of interest.
GM tried a new tactic. They turned off the heat in the plant and blocked food deliveries to the sit-downers. A committee of strikers went to the main gate to see what was going on.
When they go down, there's not a single factory policeman in view. They have all retreated to the women's restroom because they didn't want to be present when the attack came on the building. And that was a warning to us that something was about to happen.
The men waited. At dusk, they saw the Flint police approaching in full riot gear. They attacked with tear gas and guns. The battle lasted into the morning hours. Ironically, GM supplied the strikers weapons, slingshots fashioned from inner tubes. For ammunition, the workers used car door hinges. Each hinge weighed 1.5 pounds.
Don't get hit in the head with that.
Workers were wounded by police gunfire, but the strikers had prevailed. The police retreated to the far shore of the Flint River. The Battle of the Running Bulls was the strikers' first victory, but the strike was not over. The next day, January 12th, the strikers watched silently as the National Guard rolled into Flint and set up machine guns.
And they marched the National Guards up about 100 feet from us, and the commander commanded them to fix bayonets. So they put the bayonets, and those guns were loaded too. Those rifles were loaded. I said, you better give the command to take those bayonets off of those guns there, or we're going to march in between them. We're going to take the bayonets off. We're going to shove them right down their throat. Now, if you think we're fooling, you're crazy as hell. They just marched right in between the National Guard. These National Guards, some of them in their teens. And that was 5 degrees above zero, but they were sweating. And we went back to the commander and said, now, as far as we're concerned, this is a peaceful sit-down strike. And we're here in support of that strike. And we're going to do everything necessary to see that they win the strike. We don't care if it's the National Guard or who it is. So he gave the order to take the bayonets off the rifles, stand at ease, and he told us to run back in a picket line.
As the sit-down continued in Flint, Walter Reuther began calling support strikes at GM plants in Detroit. Cadillac and Fleetwood sat down. In Oakland, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Kansas City, Missouri, Cleveland, Ohio, and Anderson, Indiana, strikes paralyzed the General Motors operations nationwide. But GM refused to yield.
As the days go by, you wonder, when the company's going to start bending.
And isn't the company going to face the reality? They're going to have to recognize us, have all this confidence, and as days go on, you wonder how it's going to end. Is this company just going to hold out forever?
Day, and the strike was in its 29th day, and the men in the plant were beginning to feel the strain of separation from family and friends.
We never expected to have a strike that long. We thought, my God, how are we going to keep them in? But here, this has gone for over a month. So we said something has to be done to add spirit to the strike and give it a lift.
The strike leaders devised a secret plan to deliver a crippling blow to the heart of the General Motors operation. Their target was a vital and heavily guarded building, GM Engine Plant Number 4. To draw the guards away from the engine plant, they staged a mock strike at Plant Number 9. Even the men in Plant 9 thought that this was a real strike. Union leaders hoped that they would fight just long enough for the UAW to take control of the engine plant.
It was announced that we were going in front of Chevy 9, and all the women, it was a tremendous picket line, were standing there right in front, and we had clubs, just for the sake of having clubs. We didn't know what we were going to use for. Then suddenly, one of the strikers in Chevy 9 broke the window, and he yelled out, "The guards are choking us." And that was gas. All of us dashed and broke all the windows possible.
Jeez.
The battle in Plant 9 raged for 45 minutes, and many inside were severely beaten, but the plan worked. The engine plant, left unguarded, was seized.
How could anybody absolutely just fall for something like that? All right, they didn't know what was going to happen. But to take the 200 police that they had in Chevy 4 and to take them out and just, why didn't they leave 200 here and 200 in another place, Well, they didn't. They absolutely were stupid.
When the union's inspiration through the workers' vote shall run, there can be no power greater.
The union had forced the largest automaker in the world to the bargaining table. On February 11, 1937, General Motors and the UAW signed a single-page contract. GM was the first of the big three to recognize the union.
Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong. They have taken names from the stuff they never thought to earn.
You were there for over a month, never sleeping, never eating, never knowing what was going to happen the next day, You were just sort of as if you were in a dream, really. And then suddenly it happened, They came out. You saw them coming out, It was just wonderful.
Our years now. The effect of what we did in 37 will still be going on. I'm sure of that because we were the forerunners of the civil rights, equal rights, and we went down for the rights of our sisters to belong to the union and join it, work with us.
Labor's sit-down hysteria spread. At the height of the strike that closed 4 of Detroit's leading hotels for 2 days, armed police blocked the doors. 2,500 guests have had to leave. Waitresses, cooks, and bellhops refused to work, but signed time for play.
Johnson, crippled widow of the late explorer, is one of the guests compelled to move out. In the arms of an obliging cop, Mrs. Johnson takes her troubles quite cheerfully. Ethel Chassé, famous radio singer, has just arrived. The law says she shall not pass, so Ethel decides on a sit-down of her own.
People organized themselves. They came by the tens of thousands. And all kinds of people. They were all joining the CIO. They were joining the UAW, and that's the other unit. They were joining the CIO. It was a crusade.
All right, so you can see that this UAW strike then led to other strikes across the country as business leaders could no longer ignore the Wagner Act. And anyway, we will continue on when I see you next week.
Good luck with today's lesson.